Our job as journalists, the way I see it, is not to make a pronouncement, not to convince people to think one way or the other, but to explain why things happen. Suddenly they're telling us as reporters, we can't include something that's true because it goes against some kind of narrative.
Colorful, sharp, liberal, often satirical, journalist for 15 years at Rolling Stone with famous articles like The Great American Bubble Machine, in which Matt Taibbi refers to Goldman Sachs as a, quote, vampire squid wrapped around the face of humanity. Yet, Matt and I are finding a rather large common ground in the year 2022. Matt Taibbi writes across the board in finance, sports, international policy, presidential campaign trails, and everything else. He started overseas, specifically in Uzbekistan, until being deported for a piece at the Associated Press that was critical of the country's president. Then in Russia, Matt edited The Exile, an irreverent newspaper for Moscow's expatriate community. His time there is told in his first book, The Exile, Sex, Drugs, and Libel in the New Russia. His entire career is branded by this highly subjective, often brazen journalism, and it's done well for him. But as we've seen, the left has now fractured, castigating any and every liberal who doesn't accept their orthodoxy without questions. Liberals like Matt. In 2020, Matt announced the majority of his work would no longer be published at Rolling Stone. He planted his own flag at Substack, continuing journalism independently. In this episode, we discuss what's left for liberalism, and even journalism now, plus some stories from his time on the presidential campaign trail, and what happened after Matt committed the egregious sin of reviewing Matt Walsh's What is a Woman? Hey, and welcome. This is the Ben Shapiro Show Sunday Special. The show is sponsored by ExpressVPN. Protect your online privacy today. ExpressVPN.com/Ben. Just a reminder, we'll be doing some bonus questions at the end with Matt Taibbi. The only way to get access to that part of the conversation is to become a member. Head on over to dailywire.com/Sunday. You can click that link in the episode description. Use code BEN for 25% off. You'll have access to all of the full conversations with every one of our awesome guests. Matt, thanks so much for joining the show.
Thanks so much for having me, Ben. Appreciate it.
So why don't we start with the obvious here, Matt, which is that it's super weird that we're talking to each other. So like 15 years ago, this would have been almost unthinkable, right? I was working
Absolutely.
at Breitbart circa about 2012, 2013, and you were writing for Rolling Stone, and it was, pitched battles in the streets and all the rest. And yet now here we are. So what exactly changed, do you think, that's now made conversations like this possible on the one hand and forbidden on the other?
Well, I think there's been a significant changing of what the mentality is on what used to be my side of the aisle. I mean, people like me, I'm basically like a middle of the road ACLU, old school liberal. I believe in free speech, civil liberties, due process, all of those things. People like me are really kind of dinosaurs, are no longer welcome on the new left, which has taken this dramatic turn towards censoriousness and toward a more authoritarian approach to some problems. I think there's a belief that the old leftist approach, or the old liberal approach, is ineffective. And so, we've all been sort of kicked out of the club, basically. So without changing any point of view at all, really, suddenly people like you and me are media bedfellows.
Yeah, Matt, this is something that I find just utterly bewildering, because if you watch sort of the progress of American politics since the 1960s, there's no question that liberalism was winning. I mean, on nearly every front, social front, fiscal front, maybe even the foreign policy front, maybe. But on the first two, for sure. I mean, there's no question that the left had been in the ascendancy my entire lifetime. And so the sort of radical shift to, you guys are wildly ineffective, stop talking to people on the other side, we can't have free speech, we need to lock this stuff down to avoid offending people. Where do you think this is coming from?
I have no idea, but I totally agree with you. When I was growing up, there would have been no thought at all of conservatism as an attractive ideology for a young person. Like that was completely out of the realm of possibility. But now I think you see it very significantly with something like humor. There's just no sense of humor on the political left now. And that used to be the exclusive province of the political left once upon a time. I mean, I grew up listening to Richard Pryor albums and, that Sam Kinison. That was my education growing up. And those were our people, we thought. And now all of a sudden, there's no joking allowed on this side of the aisle. And that's one of the things that's funny, incidentally, about Matt Walsh's movie, is that it's done with a kind of sense of humor and a satirical bent that's sort of taboo on our side of the aisle now, which I find really strange because that shift happened almost overnight and imperceptibly.
So, Matt, you mentioned Matt Walsh's movie, What is a Woman?, which is a massively successful documentary for us. I mean, it's done unbelievable business. It hasn't received a single mainstream review. And of course, when we sent out the movie for review to all of the reviewers, we got back just nasty notes, cursing, people saying they definitely would not watch it. Even the prospect of having received the email was apparently like some sort of digital form of bubonic plague. Like to even have been reached out to meant that you were now infected and you had to be quarantined for a particular period of time. You wrote about this. You wrote about the fact that people on the left were either completely ignoring the film or just ripping it without having seen it. And you received an extraordinary amount of blowback. Can you talk about what drove you to write the piece and then what was the blowback like?
Yeah, so first of all, I had kind of tried to stay away from the issue. It's complicated. I try to avoid issues that I don't know a whole lot about. But I had done a couple of stories that touched on this basically from the speech angle, and I'd had a really unusual experience. I mean, I've been a reporter for 30 years now, and it's always the same method. You call around a whole bunch of people, you ask them all what they think, and then at the end, you kind of aggregate all the opinions and figure out where the story is. But with the trans issue, what I found is I would call some people and they would talk to me, and then there'd be this other group of people who would be furious that you even called, would refuse to have any kind of discussion, would call you a transphobe for even asking certain kinds of questions. And this is before you even have a point of view on the subject. So I was, I thought that was odd. And then I had done an interview with a woman named Kara Dansky, who is a feminist, a gender critical feminist. And it's not that I purposely shelved it. I just didn't want to deal with the blowback that I knew was going to come. I kept telling myself it wasn't the right time. So I felt guiltier and guiltier about that as time progressed. And when Matt's movie came out, when As a Woman came out, I realized I thought this was an opportunity to kind of fix that problem of having, not run that interview. So I did both at once. I reviewed Matt's movie and ran that interview at the same time. And the response was unbelievable just for reviewing the movie. Forget about what I said about it. I lost friends over that. There were people who I've known for decades who have now basically said that I'm a transphobe, and I'm kind of out of their loop now.
So unfortunately, I think that what you went through is not a unique experience. It seems like a lot of what's happened in politics, and maybe this is the big difference between traditional liberals and the new left movement, is a question of how people identify. And I don't mean identify in terms of gender. I mean what people see as the core of them. So when people feel that the core of them is their politics, that the politics is who I am, and then there's an attack on their politics, it's an attack on core identity, it's an attack on me, and that must never be allowed. And to even sit down with anybody who would attack my politics means that you are trying to erase me. A lot of the language that's now applied that used to be applied on issues that are immutable, like issues of biology. Now it's applied to political viewpoint. It's like if you don't see me unless you just agree with me. And to sit down with somebody who disagrees is somehow seen as a mark of, as you say, phobia.
Yeah, and that's especially problematic in my job, right? If you're a reporter, I mean, your job is to sit down with all types of people, and we're not supposed to render judgment. We're supposed to understand primarily. One of the first moments when I realized something really dramatic had changed on our side of the aisle came in the 2016 election, and I was doing a campaign story. I had covered the presidential elections for Rolling Stone for 5 election campaigns, and I interviewed a guy from Wisconsin who said, my whole family was Democrat. We've never voted for a Republican. I'm a union member, but they lied to us about NAFTA, and I'm going to vote for Trump because, they lied to us. And I put that in my piece. I didn't have an opinion on it. I just put it in the piece. And I got all this blowback from colleagues who were saying, you're validating the economic insecurity argument. Trump is entirely about race. It's entirely about racism and xenophobia. And, I understood where they were coming from, but our job as journalists, the way I see it, is not to make a pronouncement, not to convince people to think one way or the other, but to explain why things happen. And I think Trump was a phenomenon that had a lot of explanations. And one of them was the one that this guy in Wisconsin was talking about. He felt lied to. And so suddenly they're telling us as reporters, we can't include something that's true because it goes against some kind of narrative. That was crazy. I had never seen that in journalism before. And that was a signal to me that something big was going on.
Yeah, Matt, and this is sort of a broader theme that you've been writing about for years, but has really been exacerbated, I think, on all sides of the political aisle, and that is just institutional distrust. The left had a sort of congenital institutional distrust with regard to, say, corporate America, and the right was more trusting, and now the right is not trusting with regard to corporate America. Or the right had a congenital trust of, say, the FBI, and now the right is not trusting of the FBI. And it feels like there's now sort of a consensus position over the last several years that's an anti-establishment consensus. It's now a consensus that the institutions have dramatically failed us, and that the people who continue to promote those institutions are sort of whistling past the graveyard, and it's creating some very weird political undercurrents and dynamics.
Absolutely, and if you didn't see that as a primary driver of what was going on in 2016, you weren't a very good campaign reporter, I don't think. I think it was very obvious in 2016 that what drove both the Bernie Sanders movement and the Trump movement was this enormous groundswell of distrust towards institutional America. And Trump picked up on it very early. Whether he went after NATO or the intelligence services, and especially us. I remember this. I was in these halls when, we'd all be behind the rope line in the press corps, and Trump would start to go after us, and he would say, look at those bloodsuckers, they hate you, middle America, they want me to lose, they want you to lose, and people would throw stuff at us. And a lot of the reporters didn't understand it. I totally got it, because what I saw was, these are people who felt that the press and all these other institutions had betrayed them, especially after 2008. And it made total sense to me. But I think to a lot of other people, it doesn't. They still don't get it, that this is out there, that middle America feels this way. And I'm flabbergasted that there are still people who don't see it.
It really is kind of amazing because I think that the blinders have really come off to the idea that the people who purport to speak for particular institutions are really just speaking for themselves, and that the institutions in which we place our trust are a guise for their own power. Now, this struck me pretty forcibly in the last few weeks, actually, when I was looking at what was going on at the World Economic Forum. You had people like Klaus Schwab, who was out there saying, we have the power in this room to remake the world in our own image. And I was thinking, wait, hold up a second. You, a second ago, were talking about the power of laissez-faire economics and the power of capitalism. And as a person who's conservative libertarian minded on economics and on most other issues, I was like, okay, well, that part sounds good. But then you immediately shift into, okay, but we and our friends, we who are answerable to no one, can now decide what policies ought to be purveyed to the vast majority of the globe. And I feel like you're lying to me. What you're basically saying to me right now is that you want to use the power of institutions you didn't create in order to ram down an agenda that none of us approved. And it feels like that's happening in institution after institution.
Yeah, absolutely. And this may be something that I had a little bit of a sneak peek look at because I lived in Russia for 10 years before I moved back to the States in the early 2000s, and those meetings at Davos, where officials who were close to the Yeltsin administration, there were lots of backroom deals that were done, in Switzerland that had an enormous impact on the future of Russia at the time, and I had to pay a lot of attention to that. That was not something that I think the average American had to think about ever until very recently. But now we do have to think about these sort of unaccountable international institutions, or whether, domestically here in the United States, institutions like the CIA, the NSA, the FBI, these sort of permanent bureaucracies, they do have an impact on politics. I think we've seen this very graphically. And the ordinary American is now, I think, more attuned to that than they ever have been before.
So what do you think that the solution to some of that stuff is going to be? Because there's one mentality, which is, okay, burn it all down, get rid of all these institutions, start ground up, or don't start over at all. And the other is we can kind of correct within the institution. It seems like the natural inclination for people within the institutions is to do neither of those. It's just to kind of turtle, just go into the shell, claim that everybody who opposes you is obviously some sort of extremist. You see this from big tech, which is trying to shut down opinions they don't like, or you see it from, for example, during COVID, the CDC, which would immediately declare that their public health opinions were the science. And then 5 months later, they would realize that they were wrong, and that became the new science. But how do you think that that's going to shake out? Because and what we're talking about in terms of the reaction could be quite dangerous. I mean, some of these institutions are still kind of necessary, and they do need a serious corrective.
Yeah, it's an enormous societal problem when the public doesn't trust institutions. Beginning with the media. Frankly, I think it's a huge problem when people don't trust the news that they get over the airwaves. I've written about this. Walter Cronkite was voted the most trustworthy person in America twice, once at the beginning of the 70s and once in the middle of the 80s. That would never happen today. Like, the most trustworthy person in America being a mainstream news anchor would never happen today. But the public needs to have some faith in the FBI and, in all these other institutions. But I think you're right. I think the inclination of the people who are sitting in those chairs right now is not to fix the problem or not to recognize the problem. The only solution from where I sit is they have to govern better. They have to do a better job of providing for the population. And that seems to be the last thing that occurs to them. Like, they all want to get into power through some kind of political machination, whether it's impeaching the people in the other party or using some kind of messaging campaign that they think will temporarily get them over. It's not going to work. The only thing that's going to work is actually delivering for people and getting them better jobs and getting them better lifestyles. And they just don't want to do it. I don't understand why.